from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are most pleased to welcome you to a 2-week series discussing outfitting and guides and this whole process of how we do enjoy and appreciate the outdoors. But the emphasis of these two programs will be how guides are licensed and how they can help you on the kind of trips that you've often dreamed of and you may not have wished to pursue this on your own. We'll be talking about such areas as whitewater rafting, lots of hiking and touring, all the exploring the beautiful Pacific Northwest. But on this program, the emphasis will be on the state of Idaho. And we're very fortunate to have an expert with us to take us through this 2-week series. I welcome to the program Dean Sangray. He serves as the Executive Director of the State of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board. Our guest was born and grew up in Pennsylvania and came to the state of Idaho 32 years ago. He also served in the Air Force for 4 years during the Vietnam era, and that's how he got to Idaho in those days. He is also a financial management and business administration person, and he is also the former general manager of the Soldier Mountain Ski Area, which is located at Fairfield, Idaho. He also has several years' experience as a supervisor of the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation before taking his present position. Mr. Sangray, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the program, and we appreciate your coming all the way from Boise to Coeur d'Alene to be with us on the program, and we look forward not only to your comments in the two programs, but I want to tell our viewers that next week we have some nice videotape that you will show so we can take our visitors to the outdoors in Idaho. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm always pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is a lawyer in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And as always, I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning on our program.
To begin our program today, it would probably be helpful for our viewers to have some terms defined. What exactly is outfitting? What is guiding? Those terms would be helpful for us to know what those activities consist of.
Very well, that's a good place to start. The state of Idaho does make a distinction between an outfitter and a guide. The outfitter is the business entity or individual that owns the business, owns all of the equipment, the tangible assets, does the marketing and booking of the trips and so forth. Additionally, then the outfitter will hire employees to help him or her provide the services around the state on their trips, and these employees are the guides. Presently, we license about 400, average about 400 outfitters per year around the state, and additionally 2,000 to 2,100 guides.
Wow, that's quite a number of people who are involved in this outdoor activity in Idaho. What kinds of things would outfitters be doing? What sorts of activities?
There's a wide spectrum of recreational activities that are regulated, recognized by the board that need to be regulated. And the common ones that everyone is pretty familiar with is backcountry hunting in the fall, this time of the year, and the whitewater rafting, perhaps steelhead fishing during the fall and the winter. Aside from those, there's a much wider spectrum now of all types of recreational activities, from wintertime snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, backcountry alpine skiing, to, again, whitewater rafting, both floating and power boating on the navigable rivers around the state, and then trail rides and llama-assisted pack trips, mountain bike tours that go into the backcountry, day hikes into the backcountry lakes, those types of things.
So all kinds of activities are included within this group of people who are called outfitters and guides. How do they go about becoming licensed?
Make an application, appropriate application to the board. There are certain standard requirements that everyone is required to meet, whether they are an outfitter or a guide. Everyone that we license is required, for example, to be properly medically trained. They must hold at least a standard first aid card or more, and CPR and that kind of thing. Certain types of activities do require additional training, such as the whitewater rafting, mountain climbing, rock climbing, snowmobiling, those kinds of things.
Most of these activities take place on public lands, or are some of them on private lands as well?
Some are on private lands. The majority of the activities are on public lands, primarily because 67% of Idaho is national forest, and a combination of also with BLM land. And many of our outfitters conduct their activities on the public land.
Dean, is there some key distinction between what would constitute outfitting and guiding and what doesn't? And as I listened to you answer Janelle's question, I wasn't certain about some activities. For instance, you take hunters into the backcountry for elk or sheep. That's clearly guiding, outfitting. What if I operate a boat and take people for day cruises on Lake Coeur d'Alene? Is that considered guiding or outfitting?
Interesting you should pose the question that way. Scenic tours on lakes, primarily the major lakes up here in northern Idaho, do not fall under the purview of the licensing board, the state regulatory agency. However, power boating and all float boating on the navigable rivers, those activities do require a license from the board.
The people, and of course we have lots of recreational activities in this part of the state, but somebody who operates the parasailing, for instance, it's a day activity on water on a power boat. Is that guiding or outfitting, and would it be covered by your agency?
So far it is not. Parasailing, hot air ballooning, for example, the board was approached about that particular activity here a number of years ago and chose not to bring that under the purview of the regulations.
I take it that the authority to regulate those activities in Idaho was established by the legislature?
That's correct. Back in 1961, the board was created. Currently, the board consists of 5 members. By statute, 3 of those 5 members must be licensed outfitters and guides. The 4th member is a member at large representing the public, and the 5th is a representative of and appointed by the Fish and Game Commission.
I see. Dean, this show is seen outside of the state of Idaho in parts of Montana, Washington.
6 other states and parts of Canada, British Columbia, Alberta.
In that region, how do we compare? Do you know if any of those neighboring areas also have this kind of regulation required for guides and outfitters?
Most of our neighboring states do have some form of regulation. Idaho, interestingly, is considered, especially here in the western United States, as pretty much the leader in the different aspects of and the specificity of our regulatory process. And most specifically, our neighbors to the east, Wyoming and Montana, have probably come the closest to our having a similar operation as we do.
And if I can, maybe one, excuse me, were you?
The magnitude of our regulatory oversight.
Another kind of a nuts and bolts question. You talked earlier about the fact that you made the distinction between outfitters and guides, and I was wondering how far down an organizational chart that might go. Again, I'll use an example, whitewater rafting. The gentleman or woman who owns the business is the outfitter. Each person in a raft, let's say there's a group of people, would probably be a guide, and I think they do double duty, but let's say that there was someone who was solely responsible for cooking and handling gear and that sort of thing. Would that person also have to be licensed?
There is an exclusion in the law, in the board's rules, and the best example is the person who's participating as a camp cook in the backcountry in a hunting camp. That's the prime example. A person who is just cooking, cutting firewood, tending to the chores around camp, and maybe even taking care of saddling horses and so forth. That person specifically does not have to have a license. But if it goes much beyond that, where they would start interacting directly with some of the paying clients, then they would be required to have an appropriate qualification.
Thank you.
Dean, in answering a panel question, you indicated that the overwhelming majority of land in this state is publicly owned. You have the Forest Service land, the BLM land. and you have also state land. Put all that together, most of the rivers and the mountains and so forth would come in that area. Private land would be more likely to be farmland or cities and so forth. Based upon that, in addition to the outfitters and the guides being licensed by the Idaho board, give us examples of where those companies would need to also cooperate with federal agencies as well as be cleared by your board to be in this business to help people enjoy the outdoors.
Very much so. It's very much a joint and a coordinated process and effort between the regulatory agencies. Anyone who operates on the national forest, for example, is required to have our license and appropriate insurances and other qualifications, and they must also apply for and obtain a special use permit from the Forest Service. That requires a very similar application process as is required by us, and they are required to pay annual fees under that special use, the provisions of their special use permit, and also provide adequate liability insurance, similar to what we must have also for the issuance of the license.
I would assume that most organizations know all of this because they obviously are operating in the field, but if there's new organizations about to be licensed, your office certainly could provide the categories and information where they would need additional approval other than the State of Idaho Licensing Board. I mean, if they contact your office, you would be knowledgeable of all of this.
Yes.
Later in the program, we'll give the viewers, if they want to get a pen, an opportunity to know how they could call you. That's one of our services, so they could do that. Or we have individuals in different states that might be wanting to come into the state, and as they're preparing for getting in touch with the company, even that might be of interest to them. Another question I have concerning this whole process is that there are some specific examples of that. Over lunch, I had the advantage of talking with you and one of our employees at North Idaho College. They're both outfitting companies, and individuals who want to go with them have a very special place they want to go, but they may not be granted that because of the demand on that river and so forth. Could you give examples where in some cases it's through a lottery system and you may not get the opportunity to within a certain period of time of making that trip?
Yes, the prime example of that type of regulation or restriction on the amount of use that a certain aspect of the resource should have or should not have is the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, for example, and the Maine salmon. The trips, whether they be commercial or private, are very strictly controlled. Only a certain number of launches each day and all summer long. The trip size of the trips is regulated and watched very closely. A maximum number of clients are allowed and maximum number of boats, for example, and they specifically assign specific campsites as the multiple day trip progresses down the river, and that's where they must stay, and they have to follow very, very strict regulations about using fire pans and properly handling human waste and that kind of thing.
So I understand that some areas are more ecologically sensitive, and therefore that's why they're allowing only so many trips a year.
Yes.
Janelle Berg.
I'm going to ask a hypothetical question, although I truly wish it were real. What if I'm deciding now I want to take a trip? I want to do a horseback trip into the wilderness in the summertime. How do I go about finding the outfitter, first of all, and then what kinds of things do I need to know about this?
Okay.
How do I know that my outfitter's licensed? Is part of that question.
Okay, the best way to do that is to be very forthright and come right out and ask them. We encourage that very strongly through the board and through our educational process. Just ask them for some of their advertising. In fact, that's one of the many ways that you might identify a group of businesses that might be able to provide this service for you that you're looking for. The state has a very well organized and very active trade organization. The industry has the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association. Their home office is in Boise. That organization develops a lot of their own advertising and promotional materials for the industry, identifying groups of outfitters who provide horse riding or steelhead fishing, wintertime activities, that kind of thing.
Now, what can I expect that I'm going to get for my money? Now, I'm going to do this now with an outfitter, and I assume I'm going to have to pay some kind of a fee for his equipment and the guide for his expertise. And so, what can I expect? What am I getting in return for my money?
For your investment, you're getting a first-hand, very positive experience of Idaho and her and our wonderful natural resources and scenic beauty and all of that. The people in the industry are very well focused and trained to provide these kinds of opportunities for the recreating public. For one thing, as I mentioned earlier, their safety is of utmost concern. Properly trained, medically trained individuals are providing these services. The equipment is always very well taken care of and maintained. They also provide a perfect opportunity to learn about the environment and the resources that they're partaking on, the history of the area, and that kind of thing.
May I interrupt to tell our viewers who might have joined us in progress that our guest is Dean Sangray. He's the Executive Director of the State of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board, and we're discussing outfitting organizations and guides as they would work in Idaho. Janelle, you can continue your questioning if you wish.
Well, we were right in the middle of my trip here, that I'm going on the backcountry, and how many days do you think people should set aside? What's a reasonable amount of time to set aside for a trip?
There's a wide variety, depending on the activity that you might choose to partake in. There's a wide variety of different types of trips. Regarding a trail ride excursion, for example, they offer opportunities from 1 and 2 hour little short rides out of the corral onto the national forest, for example, to very extensive multiple day trips, perhaps up into the backcountry for a fishing opportunity to mountain lakes or other scenic areas, and they could run for multiple days, 3, 4, 5 days.
So what I hear you basically saying, it's a matter of individual preference, and there's probably something for everyone in the program.
Very much so.
Dean, Janelle started her line of questioning talking about financial return. I'm going to pick up that thread, but from a different perspective. And if you will let me, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. There are people in this area who I'm sure would say this is just another bureaucracy that we don't need. From the public's perspective, what does the public get from the fact that this activity is licensed in Idaho and most of our surrounding states and in Canada?
The peace of mind, probably as much as anything. It is the state does not take it lightly that the if you will, the unsuspecting private citizen who may be visiting here from Illinois wants to come out and has seen these movies and video clips of tremendous whitewater rafting and so forth. That isn't an activity to be taken lightly, for sure. Mm-hmm. And what they're getting for their choosing to go with a licensed outfitter is, again, the safety factor, which is foremost, and the background and the history of the area, the peace of mind. I think that's a big factor.
What does it cost if I'm in that business? What do I have to pay to get a license?
From the licensing board, an annual license costs $250. The guides licenses are also an annual fee of $85. And we have another license category that I didn't mention earlier. Certain companies or partnerships are required to license someone as their managing agent or designated agent, and we license about 250 of those each year for the corporate licenses around the state.
How much, and again, I guess I have to ask you to answer this question from the perspective of Idaho, but maybe the statistics are similar in surrounding areas. How much illegal guiding and outfitting activity goes on? In other words, unlicensed guides and outfitters operating.
It's a very serious problem, very substantial issue and problem for the board throughout the state. Honestly, it's very hard for us to get a good grasp, an accurate idea about how extensive it is. But we continually receive reports all year long, depending on the type of activity that's taking place at the present time. The hunting season is just kicking off in the backcountry, for example. And we have already received a number of reports at the office on suspected unlicensed activities, and we see that in every one of the major categories of our regulated activities. Steelhead fishing, people coming in from out of state, bringing groups with them, 8, 10, 12 people at a time. It's certainly a loss in revenue for the state in one respect, but the concern about the expanding bureaucracy, for example, we certainly don't view it as that. Obviously, it's a very needed service that we provide to the public in the industry in the state.
And I take it oversight and enforcement are part of the agency's job description. That's something that you do. You investigate claims of illegal operations?
Yes, we do.
And the penalty would be for those people who are operating illegally?
There's a wide range of possible penalties, ranging from a simple letter of reprimand, or placing someone's license on probation for a year or multiple years, depending on the severity of the violation, to suspending their operations or revoking the license. The board has authority also to do that. There's a wide range of monetary fines that can be assessed from $100 to $5,000. Again, depending on the severity of the violation. We work because it is such an extensive problem around the state. We have some very positive working relationships currently with other agencies, primarily the Department of Fish and Game for the state of Idaho, as well as the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. We work very closely with their enforcement arms and coordinate our efforts in looking into suspected unlicensed activity.
Thank you.
I promised our viewers, and I always try to keep my promises to my viewers. They're very special to us, and I told them if they got a pen or a piece of paper that we would let them have telephone numbers. And I have here, and I hope these are the correct numbers, I have a telephone number and a fax number, if I may give those, Dean. Or maybe I should ask you, I might give the wrong one. Could we give them a number of the how they could call your office, and then also how they could fax to your office? A lot of people are using fax machines now.
Certainly. I would welcome a call anytime to my office with any question about the outfitting and guiding issues. The regular business phone is area 208-327-7380, and we can certainly receive information anytime, 24 hours a day, at our fax number, which is 208-327-7382.
For those who write like I do, I take numbers very slow. I'm going to do that one more time. Again, for those out of state, it's area code 208, and of course you have to use that in-state too in most places. And the office number is 327-7380. And then the fax number, again, is area code 208-327-7382. And I'm sure some people will want to contact you if they're particularly anticipating coming to Idaho. I have a question along that line. I know that a lot of people come to our beautiful state, this pristine state. It's one of the more beautiful ones in the country, if not the most beautiful, and they want to do what our panel is talking about. They want to go horseback riding, they want to go whitewater rafting, hiking, hunting, fishing, whatever it may be. Let me, as we're getting close to the end of the program, again get back on Steve's question about the advantage, and you talked about safety and peace of mind. But let's suppose a person or a group comes to Idaho and they don't go through a licensed outfitting company, which has to also be insured, and suppose that someone is operating illegally and takes them and is not well experienced, let's suppose, and there's a very serious accident for our visitors while they're here. What happens in relation to liability compared with those that are licensed and insured? I think this would be another area that would show some advantage, because they could be very severe accidents, particularly if you're going with someone that's untrained in such a dangerous whitewater rafting.
Absolutely. Very good question. Obviously, there's a tremendous potential there for that party or that injured person and other members of the party to suffer severe losses, monetary losses or whatever, if they were dealing with someone who didn't have proper liability insurance in place.
And suppose that person didn't have that and then they don't have any money themselves, they're very poor. You might win a suit, but there might not be any revenue, right?
Exactly. There may not be any tangible assets or anything to try to take any recourse against. Additionally, our licensing law also requires all of our licensed outfitters to provide us with a performance bond. At present, it's a minimum of a $5,000 performance bond. That must be renewed and active each year when we renew the license. The bond is designed specifically for the protection of the consumer, the client.
In addition to the fun that one's having and trying to do it safely, what are some other advantages of outfitters, companies? I would assume that might affect the quality of food you have or cleaning up afterwards and trying to leave the area enjoyable for someone else. What do you require in those areas in relation to your licensing?
Specifically those types of performance standards in the wilderness. For example, our law, the licensing law for the State Licensing Board, requires that any licensee adhere to all state, local, and federal regulations that he may come under in the performance of their activities. For example, the cleanliness of the camping sites, not tying the horses to the trees in the back country in the wilderness. Those are all specific requirements under the Forest Service use permit, for example. And the outfitter is required to follow those guidelines very closely in order to protect the resource.
I assume from time to time your board also takes a careful, maybe goes on a trip or do you do any kind of surveys with the visitors and trying to determine if there's any way that you can suggest even an improvement for these trips?
We do. We have a very limited staff under our limited funding and so forth as a self-governing agency. We have a staff of part-time volunteers, part-time enforcement agents, investigators, who periodically will do that kind of a research project.
I have to interrupt. Okay. The good news is we're going to continue next week, and Dean Sangray, the Executive Director of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board, it's been a pleasure having you here. We look forward to you coming back. We can pick up at this point next time. Plus, I want to tell our viewers we're going to show them some beautiful video of Idaho and the trips in Idaho. On behalf of the panel, thank you very much, Mr. Sangray, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to be with us next week when we continue this discussion on outfitters and guides. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
We are most pleased to welcome you back to part 2 of our 2-week series that is addressing outfitting companies and guides and the kind of tours that are available to you across the United States, but our emphasis is on Idaho. We want to talk about horseback riding, hiking, hunting, fishing, whitewater rafting, but we want to do that from the perspective of how various companies are licensed in Idaho, and for visitors to our state or residents of Idaho, how you can go through those companies to enjoy the pristine Idaho. We welcome back to finish this 2-week series Dean Sangray. He is the Executive Director of the State of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board. Our guest was born in Pennsylvania, and 32 years ago he came to Idaho while he was in the service, the Air Force. where he served for 4 years during the Vietnam era. He stayed in the West, and he became the general manager of the Soldier Mountain Ski Area in Fairfield, Idaho. He is also a former supervisor with the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation, and also he has expertise in financial management and business administration. Dean, we had a wonderful time with you last week, and we talked all about the structure of the State Board of Outfitters and Guides. We're not going to go through a lot of that again this week, and we want to talk more about the kind of trips there are in Idaho. And for our viewers, if they'll stay tuned a few minutes, we're going to have some wonderful video of the outdoors in Idaho and some of the trips. But to get into the program, on behalf of the panel and staff, we welcome you back and thank you for coming up from Boise to be with us in Coeur d'Alene.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very pleased to have my regular panel with me. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
To help our viewers to understand exactly what outfitters and guides are, can you tell us what kind of activities each one is involved in?
We have a wide spectrum of activities that fall under the purview of the licensing board and their regulatory authority here in Idaho, and it ranges from summertime recreational activities, whitewater rafting primarily, probably, power boating, jet boats, trail rides, recreational hiking, llama-assisted pack trips, mountain biking tours into the backcountry, wintertime snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, and of course big game hunting in the fall.
Exactly what is an outfitter and what is a guide?
The state of Idaho does make a distinction between an outfitter and a guide. The outfitter is the business entity or the individual that owns all the equipment, the tangible assets, does the marketing, books the trips, and so forth. That individual or company in turn hires guides or their employees that will help them provide their services to the recreating public.
And I know that this must have a great impact for our state because there are a lot of people now who are involved in going on these kinds of trips in the summer and throughout the year as well. What kind of an impact does it have for the state of Idaho?
Very definitely. We, on an annual basis now, we license approximately 400 outfitters statewide, and additionally 2,000 to 2,100 guides we did last year. The financial impact to the state is very positive. I think best estimates are in the range of $60 to $65 million per year to the state's economy.
And people come from all over the world, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
To participate in our Idaho activities.
Very aggressive marketing programs, effective marketing programs practiced by people in the industry to attract people from Europe and from the Orient and so forth.
Dean, I know that tourism is an important industry in Idaho, and it's a growth industry. This is sort of a sub-section of that larger set. What's the experience been in terms of growth in guiding and outfitting? Is it also growing substantially?
Yes, it is, quite substantially. It appears that we have reached somewhat of a plateau in the numbers of licensed businesses. And that gradually increased, especially here over the last 12 or 15 years. And we've been in this range of 360 to 400 outfitters for a number of years now. Significantly, they are hiring more employees, which is a direct indication that there's more business going on all the time. We used to license 1,200 or 1,300 guides, and now we're up above 2,000.
You mentioned earlier in response to one of Janelle's questions a broad range of different kinds of activities that involve guides and outfitters in Idaho, but I wonder, is there one of those or one or two of those that account for most of the business? Which would be the most popular form of guided or outfitted activity, do you think?
The two most significant, Steve, probably is, first of all, numbers-wise, is the boating activity in the summertime. And
does that include rafting?
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Jet boat tours and rafting,
yeah,
right?
and whitewater rafting. And then close behind is the hunting activity in the fall. That's the historic mainstay, perhaps, you might say, of the industry. And as we mentioned last week, the hunting season has just kicked off in the backcountry, and there are thousands of clients who come and take advantage of hunting opportunities in the state in the fall.
And I know you just said that things in general have kind of leveled out, but are you seeing any trends, and I'm not talking about growth or that sort of thing, but any emerging markets, new kinds of guided activities that are coming on the scene?
Yes, there's been in the last 5 to 6 years in particular, I have realized or recognized a significant increase in mountain bike tours is one of the most significant, and day hikes, and some of those llama-assisted pack trips. And even here in the last couple of years, we have licensed several businesses who offer goat packing trips, and it seems to be catching on in some areas.
It's a little amazing what people will pay to do, isn't it? And that maybe brings up my last question for you. How do guided trips compare? And this is a little unfair because I'm sure there's, just like there's a huge range of activities, there's bound to be a range of prices. But how do they compare to other kinds of vacation activities?
A little hard for me to answer that question. I think we as a process, internal process at the board, we don't monitor the actual fees that are charged for different activities. But a 5 or 6 day float trip on the Middle Fork of the Salmon, for example, probably costs the participants in the range of, not sure, $1,400, $1,500, $1,600 perhaps per person. But they're getting a quality trip, disregarding the obvious benefit of seeing the tremendous backcountry scenery and interacting with nature and so forth. Class 1 meals and all the ancillary services that are provided by the outfitter and his employees. And
on the opposite end of the spectrum, a guided day hike, for instance, would be far, far, far less expensive than that.
Certainly.
Thank you.
I've been saying for 2 weeks we had some video, and we're going to show that video, both that and audio. And we're going to take our viewers on a very brief trip in Idaho. And the first one we're going to show, I believe, and thank you for sharing this video, is from the Idaho Fish and Game. We're going to look at some of the wildlife and the environment in our state on the first segment. We'll do that at this time, and then we'll ask you, Dean, to respond.
Okay.
When you're talking big game, this is about as big as it gets. Moose numbers are increasing in north central Idaho. This largest member of the deer family thrives along timbered streams. When spring reaches the mountains, most sportsmen are miles away, but for the bear hunter, it's a different story. This is when black bear come out of hibernation. They time their awakening to the appearance of new plant growth. A spring bear hunt tests eyesight and stalking skill. The rewards are unmatchable. It's no accident that big game do well here. 2/3 of the land is public forest. That adds up to a lot of living space. Northern Idaho has hundreds of miles of backcountry. A vast network of trails provides access to hikers and horsepackers. This is roadless country. Out here, the sound of truck and trail bike is replaced by the wind in the trees. Unique bird life greets the visitor, the great gray owl, a resident of the forest. Larger even than our national symbol, the golden eagle revels in high open spaces. As you leave the mountains and head west, the terrain changes. Steep slopes moderate to a gentle roll. The Snake River breaks. To a bird hunter, grass and rim rock mean something special. Chucker country. Sportsmen travel long distances each fall to take in the fast shooting and the incredible scenery. In the valleys, grassland gives way to farm crops. Ring-necked pheasants thrive on this rich food source.
For our viewers who have been joining our program after it was in progress, today we're discussing outfitting and companies and guides that will take you on wonderful trips in Idaho, and that was some video that we just wanted to show from the Idaho Fish and Game. And Dean, that was really exciting. And for those viewers who did join us, our guest is Dean Sangray, who's the Executive Director of the State of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board. Certainly we saw from that video that there's a lot of wildlife in this state and a lot to enjoy if you want to be a hunter or if you want to go out and go on trips, and you'll, I would assume, have opportunity to see what the state offers in that area.
Absolutely. Aside from the hunting aspect of outfitted and guided tours and excursions, interpretive tours, for example, down in the birds of prey area on the Snake River south of Boise. Several of our outfitters are licensed, and most of that activity is associated with float trips through the birds of prey area and interpretive programs provided by the guides themselves and the outfitter, or they may bring along experts such as Morley Nelson to interpret the different aspects of that trip.
I'm glad you mentioned Morley Nelson. We've had him on this program, I believe, twice, and what a remarkable man and what an expert on wildlife and birds in particular. He's a remarkable person. I'm glad you brought that up. It's an opportunity that people could have to meet him. We also have some video from Cascade Recreation that you shared with us, and one that excites me so much is whitewater rafting. I guess it's just a little bit the challenge of that. I've done some of that myself, and I'm going to ask our staff at this time to run about a 70-second spot on showing whitewater rafting, and then we'll have you respond to that exciting sport.
The last day of the trip begins with a relaxing float through downtown Garden Valley. Population, 60. Often we see wildlife, including ducks, otter, and deer along this stretch. But in the afternoon, the action resumes with rapids such as Bronco Billy and Staircase to get your adrenaline pumping. We also offer many half and full day trips. They vary from the Class 4 canyon run to relaxing family floats down the main Payette. Fishermen can choose a float through the beautiful Swirly Canyon, where the best spots are accessed only by river. The Carbarton Run on the North Fork of the Payette is our later season trip. The river leaves the road for most of the day, and osprey nests line the banks. This Class 3 stretch is a great family trip, and it's perfect for company picnics and group charters.
I am sure that you viewers would agree with me that that's exciting, and there are many places in Idaho that have that kind of exciting challenge with waterways. In fact, Dean, before I return to our panel to ask you questions, give us some examples of some of the most exciting places to engage in whitewater rafting in the state of Idaho.
Probably some of the premier rivers to try to participate on a whitewater raft trip would be Middle Fork and the main stem of the Salmon River. The Payette, the video that we've just watched was footage, I believe that was taken on the South Fork of the Payette River, just out of Boise. The Moyer River and the St. Joe up here in northern Idaho. And certainly the Snake River down through Hell's Canyon.
Mm-hmm. One other question I have before I return to the panel, and that has to do with in your licensing process. This is one of the more challenging type sports where there's some risk. What are some of the things that people should look for to? I assume that the outfitters company provides all the equipment and all, but how are there things that one can do that the company would urge to prepare for such a trip?
Bring your enthusiasm probably as much as anything. The companies, first and foremost, are very well trained to assist the public in being able to partake in this kind of an adventure. And there's no getting around it. Some of it is very challenging for sure, and certainly dangerous, fairly dangerous, and in some respects, certain times of the year. In the spring, when the runoff is higher, and
it's
so
much more challenging, isn't it?
Much more challenging, and that's their concern is obviously for the safety of their clients, and they want to provide them with an enjoyable and a memorable trip. It takes a lot of planning and training that is required for these people to become qualified and licensed in the first place is very extensive. The board has certain minimum requirements that must be met, and we monitor that very, very closely.
Janelle Berg.
That was a very exciting video clip, and so I want to ask you, who can go on a trip like this? Are there any restrictions?
The board, per se, does not establish any kinds of restrictions as far as age or physical capability, for example, of the client. That's obviously, and it's left up to the experts, the outfitter and the guides who are providing the trip. We do understand at the board office that some of the companies do have minimum ages that they will consider taking youngsters on float trips, for example, because of the smaller stature and the severity of some of the whitewater that they might get into.
What about the other end of the spectrum? Young people, children perhaps, can't go on certain trips, but what about on the other end of the spectrum?
I'm not aware of any, honestly, I'm not aware of any specific restrictions that some of the companies might have. I do know that some folks have come out, including my parents are probably a good example. 2 years ago when my father was 80 years old, he and my mother were here, and we took a trip on the Snake River.
I suppose, though, you have to do a little bit of training or getting in shape for some of the trips. For example, a packed trip, you probably need to do a little bit of walking in advance. Is that correct? Are there some things that would be advisable to do before you went into the backcountry for the first time?
Well, they would certainly, the outfitter, and that's where this direction and guidance would most properly come from, would recommend proper clothing, perhaps some, if they have enough lead time, perhaps some exercising and so forth that individuals might do, perhaps as a family, getting out and exercising, riding their bikes and so forth to condition themselves a little bit for a multiple-day whitewater raft trip, trail rides, backcountry skiing, cross-country skiing.
You mentioned in our last program, and I hope you'll share with our viewers again, what some of the reasons would be to go with an outfitter. Of course, one of the reasons is that many of us couldn't afford to buy our own equipment for a one-time experience. That would be, it seems to me, quite obvious. But beyond that, you indicated some of the things that one can gain by going with an outfitter.
Certainly, they can gain a better perspective on the out of doors. The outfitting companies and their employees provide an excellent source for providing historical perspective of the area that they're traveling in, for example. From a safety standpoint, there are lots of pluses for considering to go with a licensed and insured outfitter.
You said just peace of mind, knowing
Yes.
that you're in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing and has been there before.
Mm-hmm. We think that's a real plus.
Dean, as you look ahead to the future of the business, do you see challenges or are there concerns that you or your agency have of access or environmental problems or the pressure of too many people? Anything you're worried about?
The board is very concerned, and that concern is shared with our counterparts at other state agency levels as well as the federal government, the management agencies. So much of Idaho, 2/3 of Idaho roughly, is public land. Many of our outfitters are permitted and operate their businesses on that public land, and Idaho is not an unknown entity anymore. more and more every year, more people are coming. They want to take advantage of this tremendous opportunity to enjoy our resources. That is beginning to show dramatically in some areas. The overuse, and it's a very tightrope to try to follow to provide the services and the opportunities that people are looking for, but not to do that at the detriment of the resource and the environment.
It seems everywhere today that there's a concern about the cost of government, and certainly cost-cutting measures have had an effect on national parks. You're in a slightly different situation, but I'm sure that national forest lands, let's talk trails, for instance, for mountain biking or hiking or horseback riding, have to be maintained, and there are fewer dollars available for staff to do that. Does your agency have a chance to comment, or do you have a position on the question of fee per use or fee for use as one way to help fund those services?
We don't per se. The board is not or doesn't get in that position as far as offering particular input regarding what fee structures might be charged. Overall, the board does recognize, again, in companion activity with the agencies, the regulatory agencies, that there's a finite resource there, and we need to all work together, including the public, to help everyone have a better understanding about what's available and what restrictions need to be in place to help protect it for future use.
You're a regulatory agency, not an association of outfitters or guides, but I'm sure that you hear from those people. What kind of concerns do they share with you? I mean, are there problems that they're facing?
Yes, they have the association, the industry in the state has a real concern on the public's perception of the outfitters. They are very much professionals. In Idaho, in particular, the majority of our licensees are small business people, both men and women, trying to provide a meaningful opportunity and still make a living. And it's a real struggle with the additional add-ons of additional regulatory requirements and increasing fees. It's very much a struggle, and I like to think, and my board, I believe, feels very agrees that we are making very appropriate efforts to try to be responsive to all of these concerns and work closely with them to make the proper decisions.
On the program last week, we gave the telephone numbers of the Idaho State Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board because we thought some of our viewers might have questions, and we may have some viewers this week that didn't watch last week. And this time I'm going to give a telephone number, and it is area code 208-327-7380. That is the number of the board in Boise, Idaho. And then also more and more people fax, and I will give that number. It's area code 208-327-7382. Hope that's helpful.
It would be, if I may, and we missed interjecting this additional number last week. We also have a toll-free number that we identify as our enforcement hotline and encourage people who might have a concern if they've observed something that they perceive might be an unlicensed or inappropriate activity. The toll-free number is 506. It's 1-800.
It's 1-800.
5656.
Okay, again, 1-800-506-5656.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. In the brief time we have left, I want to also ask you about helping our viewers who might be considering a trip. I would like for you to choose, I don't care whether it's a fishing trip, a hunting trip, hiking, or whatever. Take us through something that they might experience. Janelle partially mentioned this last week with horseback riding, but tell our viewers what they would do and how the food would be like and how they sleep, and we haven't, I think, done that enough to entice our viewers.
Well, the video certainly helped set the stage perhaps for that. On a raft trip, for example, a multiple-day whitewater trip, you as a client, you would show up at the place of business for the outfitter, or maybe at what's called the put-in location on the river, and the outfitter and his guides will go through a orientation, a safety talk, describing what kind of situations and circumstances you're going to encounter on your trip, and fit you with appropriate safety gear, life jackets, helmets, and wetsuits, for example, depending on the time of year. And then the trip will launch, and your cameras will be close by in the dry bags so that you're able to take pictures. You'll be hearing interpretive information and historic information from the guides as you continue on your trip, stopping midway through the day for outstanding lunch on the beach in the outdoors, then a continuation of the trip during the early part of the afternoon.
The guide, they provide and the company provides the food. And are you ever asked to help prepare that, or do they do all that for you?
Oh, they do. They do it all, and a tremendous job. And then in the evening, selecting an appropriate location for setting up the tents and rolling out the sleeping bags and so forth, and preparation of gourmet dinners that can range the whole spectrum from seafood and steaks and you name it.
Well, what a nice note to end our program. I got the signal we're out of time, and I just know we've brought a lot of people to Idaho to have fun, and also people in Idaho. On behalf of the panel and the staff, I wish to thank you, Dean Sangray, the Executive Director of the State of Idaho Outfitters and Guides Licensing Board, for a 2-week series that's been exciting about our beautiful state and the kind of enjoyment you can have. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program as exciting as the panel and I have in bringing it to you. And I would invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, and we'll discuss yet another important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.